I guess to start with, if we're talking about crisis 2.0, I guess the first thing is to say I think we're still in crisis number one. And I think we haven't really gotten out of this really catastrophic recession or depression, or whatever you want to call it, that began around about 2008 and spread around the rest of the world. Where we go from here is really difficult to say, I think, in part because of the madness of the system that is capitalism. It is really difficult to predict what will happen precisely because the system is so uncoordinated, because there is no planning, there is no coordination, because there is no real integration between the different actors within the system. And this is partly why even the brightest minds didn't really see the crash coming. There were many who saw some signs of it perhaps, but because of this anarchic nature of capitalism, no one can predict with any certainty when and where it will happen. But I think what we can say for certain is that there will be a crash. And this is, I think, one of the messages that came out of the global financial crisis or the global economic crisis, which a lot of people didn't really put enough emphasis on, and that is the centrality of crises to capitalism. That these sorts of manias that Joe was talking about are normal in capitalism. They have been there from the very beginning. And the Russian revolutionary Leon Trotsky used to talk about how the human being inhales and exhales, capitalism booms and slumps. It's natural to the functioning of capitalism as a system, destructive and catastrophic as the impacts of these crises are for human beings all around the world. That is the nature of the system. And what you see in a lot of commentary on these sorts of recessions is a focus on the specifics of this current crisis that we're in right now, and a failure to remember all of the crises that went before it. And so nobody really talks anymore about the dot-com crises or the Asian financial crisis or the great crisis that happened in the early 90s in Australia. Nobody tries to draw out some of the relationships between these different crises and to observe some of the tendencies that occur within the system. So this most recent crisis, I think, is one crisis among many going throughout capitalism's history over its last few hundred years or so. But I think the current crisis, or the one that began around 2008, is also part of a period of deterioration or decline in capitalism, which can be traced back to the late 1960s and the beginning of declining rates of profit, declining rates of economic growth. So, for example, if you take the world economy as a whole, in the 1960s, the average annual economic growth rate was 3.5%. In the 1970s, it fell to 2.4%. In the 1980s, down to 1.4%. In the 90s, 1.1%. And in the first few years of the 21st century before this most recent crash, it barely reached 1%. So what we've seen over the period since the late 1960s has been a gradual decline in the health of capitalism as an economic system, which in turn has had a number of other economic and social consequences which we're all dealing with today. Now, that period of crises, really going back to the late 1960s, early 1970s, has also coincided with a much greater level of instability within the capitalist system. So between 1973 and 1997, there were 139 financial or economic crashes, compared to only 38 between the years 1945 and 1971. So we've had a lot more upheaval and instability in the system, and a number of different economists have tried to explain this. People like Robert Brenner, people like Chris Harman have pointed to the declining rates of profit in capitalism, which is a really important statistic because it tells you how attractive it is for investors to invest their money in the system. And what we've seen up and down from time to time, but what we've seen generally since that period of the late 1960s has been a declining rate of profit. Now, there are all other sorts of factors involved, and this, of course, goes back to Marx's analysis, going back to Capital, particularly Volume 3, and so on. But I think the general point is that capitalism is in a period right now, starting in that period of the late 60s, early 70s, but obviously the most recent crash has been really traumatic, but it's been a period of crisis over a number of decades, and one which arguably is getting worse and more serious. Now, I think going back again to a lot of the commentaries on this crisis, they haven't really focused on these underlying fault lines in the system, some of these underlying tendencies and laws of capitalism, which Marx identified so long ago, and which other economists, such as those ones I mentioned, have identified. We've seen too much market fundamentalism. People like Kevin Rudd, for example, in his famous essay a few years back, talked about how it was neoliberalism and markets gone mad that was the problem, not the underlying capitalist system or its flaws. And then I guess in popular culture you have films like The Wolf of Wall Street, which give you the sense that the problem is individual greed or personal greed on behalf of bankers and stockbrokers, rather than looking at the underlying structures that are the problem. And Damien Cahill, his recent book on neoliberalism, really puts the lie to that notion by focusing on the structural problems of capitalism and how it causes these sorts of crises, which have so many consequences for people all over the world. And I think if you look at the impacts on welfare, for example, because of that declining rate of growth over time, there is less money coming into the system for the governments to spend on social welfare. And so this austerity, which we've seen in one form or other really for the last 30 to 40 years, the collapse of the so-called Keynesian model, has really been a product of that declining rate of growth, which again reflects the falling rate of profit. And neoliberalism, which is that term often being used to describe a suite of policies, or the Washington Consensus, some people call it, things like privatization, opening up of foreign investment, trade liberalization. All of those policies were fundamentally designed to make economies more attractive for businesses and multinational corporations to come in and invest. And it was such a radical program of policies that were implemented by governments all around the world, effectively. What the economist David Harvey calls the modern equivalent of the closure of the commons. Neoliberalism was really designed to try to jerk capitalism out of its crisis in the 70s and the 80s, but it really hasn't worked. And there are a whole range of reasons for that, partly related to the unwillingness of governments to let these big banks and these big corporations fail for the consequence they might have on their economies. And that means that crisis is endemic to our system today. So we're dealing with a system which is deeply mired in slump, and it's very hard to see how the system internationally can get out of this crisis. Now, if you go back to the most recent, really devastating crisis before this one, it was the 1930s. And how did capitalism get out of that crisis? Well, it wasn't through the New Deal of Roosevelt and Keynesian pump priming and so on, but it was fundamentally through the horrors of World War II. The destruction that it created around the world allowed capitalism to rebuild and regrow again. And it's one of the horrors and contradictions of capitalism that it would take such colossal destruction, loss of human life, destruction of properties and so on, in order to allow capitalism to start growing again. So what it would actually take to get capitalism growing again is really mind-boggling to think about. But I think that the crisis, both in that longer term that I talked about going back to the 60s, and in the most recent terms in relation to 2008 onwards, really is central to everything that is occurring in politics and society at the moment. If you take the standout trends of the growth of Islamophobia around the Western world, particularly in Europe and to a lesser extent the United States, the attacks on refugees that we've seen all across Europe again in particular, and here in Australia to some extent, and the outgrowth of racism and nationalism have been provoked, I think, all to a large extent by the latest economic crisis. Now, they were bubbling along, you could say, for a long period of time, related to the September 11 attacks and so on. But it's no surprise that there has been such a sharp upsurge in attacks on Muslims and refugees in Europe as a result of the devastation that the crisis has caused in Europe. And so a lot of people who are suffering, a lot of people who've lost their jobs, who face insecure, unstable futures, they look to the Muslim other or the refugee as the source of their problems and blame them rather than the governments and the corporations. And that's one of the more frightening things about the present period that we're in. One of the consequences of this crisis has been the incredible eruption in politics, which we've seen around the world. Now, if you look to the United States at the moment, we see the very real possibility that we could have Donald Trump as the next president of the United States. And if you look at the pattern around the world, in particular in Europe, but also elsewhere, we've seen the election of some very strange, odd characters. And if you take that global pattern as now the norm, then you'd have to say Donald Trump is the favorite to win the next presidential election. Now, there are all sorts of people who will say that that's not possible, he can't win the liberal states and so on. But that is the trend which is occurring around the world at the moment. And again, if you take the United States, in terms of Donald Trump being in this position, so many people said he could never win the nomination. And now that he's won the nomination, people are saying, well, he can never win the presidency. He certainly can't be so sure. I think that's one of the lessons come out of it. But I think the other thing we need to say is that Donald Trump's rise is related to the economic crisis and related to the horrendous rates of inequality that occur in the United States. But it's also happened on the watch of Barack Obama. The legacy that Barack Obama has left, the left in the United States, but also across the world, because a lot of people around the world look to Obama's election with hope and some expectation that you would see real change. But what have we really seen? In reality, we've seen people's hopes really dashed. So, for example, again, on the subject of refugees, the Obama administration has been responsible for the deportation of scores of Central Americans, and many of them have ended up dead, having gone back to their home country, been sent back home by the Obama administration. We all know about the drone strikes, which have killed thousands of civilians, ordered by the President Obama. And of course, there was the bombing of the Médecins Sans Frontières hospital in Afghanistan, which was inexplicable. According to it was a war crime. The locking up of whistleblowers, people like Chelsea Manning, who may spend the best part of their life in jail, Butterford in solitary confinement, while the people who commit the war crimes that Chelsea Manning exposed are allowed free to roam the streets. The longest war ever in United States history in Afghanistan, Obama has kept America in. The lowest rate of nuclear disarmament by any US president since 1980. Obama allowed Shell Oil Company to get in and drill for oil in the Arctic Circle. The level of social and racial inequality, both of those have gone up under Obama. And it's a staggering thing to think about that most working class people, most black people, were better off under the Bush administration than they have been under Obama. And then, of course, Obama has gone to Cuba recently to lecture the Cubans on human rights. But of course, he didn't offer to give them back Guantanamo Bay, where a number of prisoners are still there, because that's another promise of his that he hasn't fulfilled. Now, of course, he will blame Congress in part for this, saying it blocked all of his initiatives and so on. But the reality is that when you look at the powers that a US president has, Obama has been one of the most reluctant to use those powers of any president in US history. So the powers that he does have, and veto powers, executive orders, he signed very few of those compared to other US presidents. So I think that Trump has risen in part because of the legacy of Obama, the record of Obama. And you can say that there are different voting constituencies. People who would vote for Obama might be different to people who would vote for Trump. Well, not necessarily the case, because actually there is a large chunk of people who were supporting Bernie Sanders up until this point. And there is quite a lot of evidence that many of those people, having not gotten Bernie Sanders as a candidate, will now move to supporting Donald Trump. So there's a large constituency of people out there who are so fed up, who are so angry at the political establishment, that they will contemplate voting for someone like Trump, simply because he sounds like a non-politician. And of course, the rise of Trump is not just related to Obama and the global financial crisis, but it occurs in the context of those extraordinary rates of inequality that occur in the United States and which gave rise to the Occupy movement and before them the anti-globalization movement. And so this is very much an international scenario that we've seen where people like Trump can potentially be close to the levers of power. In Austria recently, we went within a whisker of seeing a fascist take power there as the president. It's a largely ceremonial position there, but nonetheless, to go so close to winning power is quite extraordinary. In the United Kingdom, we've seen, although they had the election of a Muslim mayor there recently, which is a positive sign, I think something which we should take some heart out of. Nonetheless, the United Kingdom Independence Party, which is xenophobic, Islamophobic, has become the third largest or the third most popular party in the United Kingdom. France, you might remember recently a novel came out called Submission, written by a French novelist, Michel Houellebecq, where he talked about the possible takeover of the political establishment by the Muslim Brotherhood. And of course, this plays on all sorts of fears, widespread in France, of Muslims taking over French society. There is a realistic prospect of a takeover in France, but it's not by the Muslims, it's by the National Front. And the National Front is a very frightening organisation, but it currently is the most popular party in France, and it does have a realistic prospects of being competitive when it comes to the elections next year. In Sweden, in liberal Sweden, famously liberal country, fascists again are in parliament in the form of the Sweden Democrats since the year 2010. And Switzerland, Swiss People's Party, topped the vote in 2015. And in Finland, actually, the far right are in power as part of a coalition there. So really worrying trends, really striking developments. But all of them, I think, have to be seen in the context of the devastation caused by the global financial crisis and that broader period of crisis, I think, which we need to situate this in going back to the 1960s, early 70s. Now, I think in a way, coming back to France, Paris offers a little bit of a sign of what the future city is going to look like in terms of the multi-level of struggles that are occurring there. So we saw last year and earlier this year these terrible terrorist attacks which occurred there, the shooting of 130 odd people at concerts and theatres and so on. It's just unimaginable to think about that level of carnage. Put that into perspective though, when you consider that the French were responsible for up to 1 million, maybe more deaths as a result of its occupation of Algeria over a period of 130 years. And a lot of people don't make that connection in terms of the link between people targeting France, its large Algerian diaspora, and the many Algerian Muslims who remember what that occupation of their country was like by the French. Putting that to one side, if you consider Paris has seen these terrible terrorist attacks, we've seen in recent times radical demonstrations against neoliberalism in the form of new labour laws. Then we've also seen the flooding of Paris in recent times as a result of climate change. And then with the spectre of the National Front, you see Paris is engaged in a number of upheavals and struggles on many different levels. And I think in a way that captures a little bit of what the modern city is going to look like in the 21st century. Paris is obviously a big city and special in its own right, but nonetheless I think it's indicative of what we're going to see. I think there are also a number of other important connections that we can make between what is going on in the economic sphere, the terrible devastation it's caused, and other phenomena, such as the tidal wave of depression, which is sweeping the world. And I'm talking about economic depression, I'm talking about psychological depression, because there has been an enormous rise in the number of people who have succumbed to mental illness, depression and anxiety in particular. And I think it very much is connected to these problems that we've had, and not just the recent global financial crisis, but the broader term economic crisis, the alienation, the commodification of our society, the utter meaningless of capitalism has created, I think, a lot of sadness in the world. And if you think again about the specifics of the current crisis, in Greece, for example, which has been one of the hardest hit of all the countries as a result of the GFC, there was a 25% increase in the suicide rate in 1 year in Greece as a result of this crash. And then there was a famous case of a pensioner who, faced with his pension getting cut by the government, shot himself in the head in front of the Greek parliament. And so there is an enormous well of misery and sadness around the world, and I think a lot of it is connected to the economic crisis and the broader malaise of capitalism. You can add to a number of those these disease outbreaks that we've had. If you think about it, we've had bird flu crisis, we've had Ebola last year, now there's the Zika crisis, and people are worried about what impact it will have, sending 500,000 people into Brazil and then sending them back to their own countries, possibly bringing back Zika with them. Now, a lot of this is related to what the American author Mike Davis talks about in the planet of slums that we live in, increasingly unsanitary living. Neoliberalism is implicated in this, in the running down of public health spending and the capacity of governments to be able to deal with some of the disease outbreaks that occur. So we have dodged a bullet with some of these disease outbreaks up till now, but we never know when the next one will hit and how devastating it will be because of some of these structural problems that we've got. Now, just to finish on, I think some of the vulnerabilities of Australia. I said at the beginning it's impossible to predict when the next crash will be, when the current one will end, how Australia badly will be hit, and so on. But the first thing I'd say is, if we are not currently in a recession, which we technically aren't, then we should be very afraid of what a real full-blown crisis should look like. So I heard on the news today that Bill Shorten said that there isn't enough money in the system to scrap the GST on tampons. And I thought to myself, well, if there isn't enough money for such a relatively small spending item in the budget, what does that tell you about the social welfare capacity of our system? And this is in a period of non-crisis. So what would it be if we face a really serious recession? Obviously, China is a very important factor in this. Australia, I think, avoided a recession partly for the reasons that Joe talked about with the banking system, but also I think because Australia had this very close relationship with China. I don't think it had a lot to do with the Rudd administration's stimulus package. I think it may have had some impact, but largely because of the mining boom and Australia's relationship with China. China purchases some 25% of all of Australia's exports. But we know that China is in deep trouble, and we know that China has been on this massive lending binge, that there are hundreds of so-called ghost cities in China, where all the sorts of apartments and malls have sprung up and nobody lives in them. And it's really on the brink. But also that we don't hear a lot about a lot of the resistance that goes on in China all over the country. And there is a lot of rebellion, a lot of resistance. The environmental crises that China faces, and of course the international conflicts which it's steadily getting itself more involved in. So because Australia is very closely related to China, it's vulnerable to what happens in China. And I think in that sense the collapse of the iron ore price, which was Australia's most important export up until quite recently. The price of iron ore was $190 per tonne in 2011, and today is down to $50 per tonne. There's been an enormous collapse in iron ore price, and that costs a lot of government revenue. And the Treasury predictions at the moment are based on a price of $55, but it's expected to go down to $40 in the next year or so. The housing bubble that, again, Joe referred to, the housing price income ratio in Australia at the moment is 12. Now, in the US it was 5 before the real crash happened, and in Ireland it was 8 before they had their crisis. So there are other things that involved there and a lot of the differences, but Australia is quite vulnerable to this housing bubble collapse. That's another potential vulnerability. The indebtedness also that Joe was talking about. Australians are among the most risk of credit default in the world. Some 2 million Australians are at risk of credit default. We've seen the rises in inequality. So over the last 30 years, the richest 10% of Australians have gained half the income growth. The richest 1% have gained 22% of the income growth. So again, this is occurring in a period of so-called boom. We can only imagine what would happen if Australia has a really serious crash. We've seen also, I think, a spate of cases of underpayment of wages, not just with 7-Eleven, but recently with Coles paying of under-reward wages, fruit pickers, Coca-Cola workers a couple of years ago were given a new deal, which led to, in some cases, a 40% reduction in their pay. And I think this is part of the story of the Australian boom, so to speak, is the underpayment, the exploitation, the intensification of people's work patterns. So there are a number of these pressures which are coming to bear on Australians, and I think it struck me listening the other day with the floods that we've had over the last week or so. The police were talking about how the number of drivers who would drive through flooded waters, and they couldn't understand why people would do that. And I think it is actually quite easy to understand, because people are under enormous pressure, whether it be to work, this inability that we have at the moment to not be able to stand still and to just keep moving. And I think when you see that water flowing across the causeway, people will take a risk because they can't take the risk of standing still. And I think a lot of the intensification of life and pressure related to neoliberalism is partly the explanation for that. So I think to conclude, I think we are not currently technically in a crisis, but heaven help us if one does happen. And I think we should be very afraid of that. But I think we should also be somewhat confident that there will be resistance, whether it be here in Australia, whether it be internationally, there will be some resistance. This is the period of the Occupy movement, that audacious movement that sprang up a few years back, the anti-globalization movement before that, and different struggles around the world, the rise of the Greens here. While the Greens have their own problems, they have ideological clarity issues and so on. You can talk about those sorts of electoral hurdles to their success, but nonetheless, the rise of the Greens gives us some cause for optimism, I think, about the future, along with one of those other things that I mentioned before.